When you close your eyes at night, do you ever wonder about the darkness beyond? Not the simple absence of light, but something older, something vast and patient, watching from spaces between worlds. The entity is that darkness made manifest, a cosmic horror that has existed since before memory, feeding on the most profound emotions humanity can produce. Its story is one of ancient hunger, calculated cruelty, and an intelligence that spans the infinite breadth of the multiverse. Over the next hour, we'll journey through fragments of understanding, piecing together the nature of this unknowable being, its origins, its realm, and the carefully crafted nightmare it has built across countless realities. Before we can understand what the entity has become, we must first try to comprehend what it was in the beginning. This is no simple task, for the entity's origins stretch back beyond recorded time, beyond the birth of stars, perhaps even beyond the formation of the universe itself. What we know comes from scattered observations, cryptic journal entries, and the fragmented memories of those who have glimpsed its true nature. The picture that emerges is one of cosmic horror on a scale that challenges human comprehension, a species of beings that drift through the void between worlds, ancient beyond measure, feeding on the raw emotional energy of conscious beings. The observer, that trapped scholar who watches from his tower between dimensions, was among the first to document a crucial truth about the entity. In his earliest entries, recovered from the archives that exist within the realm itself, he made a startling discovery. He didn't refer to the entity as a singular being, an isolated god of suffering. Instead, he spoke of them, plural, multiple entities, a species of darkness that moves through the cosmic night like predatory fish through deep ocean waters. This revelation changes everything we thought we understood. The entity that has created the realm, that pulls killers and survivors from across the multiverse, is not unique. It is simply one member of a race of beings so ancient and so alien that human language struggles to describe them adequately. These beings, sometimes called the Ancients in various recovered texts, exist in a state that defies conventional understanding of life and death, matter and energy. They are not creatures in any sense we would recognize. They don't have bodies in the traditional sense, though they can manifest physical forms when it suits their purposes. They are more akin to vast consciousnesses, intelligences composed of something far stranger than flesh and blood. The few who have perceived them directly describe them as shadows given thought, as hungers that learned to think, as voids that somehow achieved awareness. One particularly haunting description from an unknown source calls them the spaces where light dies, given terrible purpose. What little evidence exists suggests these ancients drift through the vast emptiness between universes, moving through the cosmic void with a patience that only immortal beings can possess. They exist in the great dark, in the spaces where reality grows thin, where one universe brushes against another in the infinite multiverse. Imagine the space between atoms, but on a cosmic scale, the gaps between entire realities, the cracks in the foundation of existence itself. This is where they dwell, where they wait, where they hunt. They are not bound by the physical laws that govern matter and energy within a single universe. They exist outside, or perhaps alongside, moving through dimensions that human minds cannot perceive, let alone comprehend. The nature of these beings raises profound questions about the structure of reality itself. If they exist between universes, what does that say about the multiverse? Is it simply an infinite collection of bubble universes floating in a void, with these ancients swimming through the darkness between them? Or is reality something stranger still, with these beings occupying some fifth-dimensional space that intersects with all possible realities? The observer's notes suggest the latter, though his understanding seems incomplete, fragmented by the impossibility of truly grasping what these entities are. He describes moments when he caught glimpses of them, not just the entity that created his prison, but others. Distant shadows in the cosmic night, vast and terrible, each one a universe of hunger unto itself. But what makes this particular entity special? Why focus on this one being among what may be countless others of its kind? The answer lies in what it has done, in the unprecedented nature of its hunting ground. While its siblings drift through the void, perhaps feeding on whatever ambient emotions they encounter, perhaps existing in ways we cannot fathom, this entity has done something different. It has learned, it has adapted, it has created. This entity looked at the multiverse, at the countless worlds teeming with conscious, feeling beings, and it saw not just a feeding ground, but an opportunity. It saw the potential to create something sustainable, something efficient, something that could produce the emotions it craves in a controlled, repeatable fashion. This entity became a farmer, where others remained mere hunters and scavengers. The comparison to more familiar concepts of cosmic horror is inevitable. Students of dark literature might recognize echoes of other entities, the great old ones, the outer gods, the things that should not be. These fictional horrors, born from human imagination trying to grapple with cosmic meaninglessness, pale beside the documented reality of the entity. Where those imagined monsters often seem to exist in a state of divine indifference, barely aware of humanity's existence, the entity is terrifyingly attentive. It notices, it cares. Not in any way that brings comfort, of course, but it is intimately, obsessively focused on human emotion and suffering. This attention, this horrible interest in every nuance of fear and hope, makes it somehow worse than a mindless force of destruction. What we must understand about the entity is that before it created the realm, before it learned to construct trials and manipulate realities, it existed in a state we can barely imagine. Picture a consciousness without form, an intelligence without senses as we understand them, drifting through the void for eons beyond counting. What would such a being think about? What would drive it? The answer, as far as we can determine, is hunger. Not the simple hunger of a body requiring fuel, but something more fundamental. The ancients, including our entity, feed on emotion. This is not metaphorical. Emotion, in all its complex, multifaceted glory, is their sustenance. Fear, hope, rage, despair, joy, love, hatred. These are not abstract concepts to the entity. They are food, as real and necessary as bread to a human being. But why emotion? What is it about the complex electrochemical responses of conscious beings that sustains these cosmic horrors? The Observer theorized about this in his later entries, when madness was beginning to creep into his words. He suggested that emotion might be a form of energy, something that exists outside the normal matter-energy relationship of physics. Consciousness, he proposed, creates ripples in reality itself, small ones, barely perceptible, but present nonetheless. When a being feels something strongly, truly, intensely, these ripples become waves. The ancients, existing as they do in the spaces between realities, can perceive and consume these waves. Emotion becomes radiation, and they are drawn to it like plants to sunlight, like humans to a feast laid out before them after years of starvation. This theory, if true, explains so much about the entity's behavior. It's not simply causing suffering for the sake of some incomprehensible alien philosophy. It's not enacting some bizarre cosmic joke or fulfilling some prophecy written in the fundamental mathematics of the universe. It's eating everything the entity does, every carefully crafted trial, every killer chosen and survivor taken, every moment of hope granted and despair inflicted. All of it serves the purpose of generating the emotional energy it requires to sustain its existence. The realm is not a torture chamber built by a sadistic god. It's a farm. The survivors are crops. Their emotions are the harvest. And the entity is an impossibly patient, impossibly clever farmer who has learned exactly how to maximize its yield. Yet, even among its own kind, this entity stands apart. The evidence suggests that most of the ancients exist in a more passive state, perhaps feeding on the natural emotional output of the universe, the background radiation of feeling that conscious beings produce simply by existing. They drift, they consume what they encounter, they move on. This entity, however, developed something its siblings seemed to lack: ambition. It looked at the chaotic, inefficient process of hunting for emotional energy across the multiverse and thought, there must be a better way. It observed countless worlds, watched civilizations rise and fall, studied the patterns of conscious life with the dedication of a scientist conducting a lifelong experiment. And then, at some point in the distant past, it began to act on what it had learned. The first evidence of the entity's presence in human history is fragmentary at best, scattered across the countless parallel universes it has touched. But there are patterns, recurring themes, that suggest humanity's first encounters with this being happened far earlier than we might imagine. Cave paintings discovered in certain remote locations across various realities show imagery that is disturbingly consistent: spiral patterns, reaching claws, figures being drawn up into darkness. Ancient oral traditions from disparate cultures speak of the dark hunger, the thing in the fog, the spider in the night. These stories were dismissed as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, as the products of prescientific minds trying to make sense of a chaotic world. But what if they weren't merely myths? What if these ancient peoples were documenting real encounters with something that had begun to take an interest in humanity? The entity's first contacts with human consciousness must have been tentative, experimental. Imagine it encountering Earth, or one of the countless parallel Earths scattered across the multiverse, for the first time. Here was something new, or at least novel to this particular ancient. Not just life, not even just conscious life, but beings with rich inner worlds, complex emotional landscapes that shifted and changed with dizzying rapidity. Humans felt everything so intensely, so chaotically. They created meaning where none existed, built elaborate mental frameworks to explain their existence, loved and hated and feared with an intensity that must have been intoxicating to a being that fed on such things. The entity had found its perfect prey. Early human encounters with the entity would have been brief, probably confusing for both parties. The entity was learning what these strange, short-lived creatures were, what made them produce the strongest emotional responses. Humans, in turn, were trying to comprehend something their minds were not evolved to understand. The entity at this stage was probably crude in its approaches, causing disappearances, inspiring terror through its mere presence, feeding on the raw fear it generated, but not yet understanding how to maximize and sustain that fear. These early experiments left their mark in human mythology, in the stories told around fires to warn children about the dangers lurking in the dark. The entity became the thing that took people in the night, the monster lurking just beyond the firelight, the incomprehensible horror that could snatch you from the safety of the tribe. One particularly compelling theory, originating from careful analysis of the plague's backstory, suggests that the entity's first organized worship may have begun in ancient Babylon. Adiris, the woman who would become the plague, served a religion that venerated something dark and terrible, something that demanded devotion and sacrifice. Her faith was so absolute that when she heard a whisper, just a single whisper, it was enough to make her kill her mentor and eventually lead her people down a path of fanatical worship. That whisper came from somewhere. That something she worshipped was real enough to answer her prayers by taking her into its realm. The religion that Adiris practiced, with its strange rituals and human sacrifices, with its emphasis on devotion through suffering, bears all the hallmarks of entity worship. If this theory holds true, then the entity's influence on human civilization goes back thousands of years. The religion that Adiris followed might have been the seed from which the Black Veil cult would eventually grow, spreading across not just one world, but multiple realities, adapting to each new universe it encountered while maintaining its core purpose, worship and service to the darkness that feeds on suffering. The survivors of Babylon's fall, those who witnessed Adiris being taken into the fog, would have carried stories of what they saw. Some would have been terrified, certainly, but others might have been inspired. They saw their high priestess ascend into darkness, saw the entity she worshipped claim her as its own. To true believers, this would have been the ultimate validation of their faith. The spread of entity worship across the multiverse represents something chilling. The idea that this cosmic horror has not just hunted humanity, but has convinced some humans to willingly serve it. The Black Veil cult appears in records from dozens of different realities, each version slightly different, adapted to the specific culture and time period, but all sharing certain unmistakable characteristics. They wear dark veils or hoods, hiding their faces from the world. They perform rituals designed to attract the entity's attention, often involving torture, mutilation, and sacrifice. They seek out individuals who show potential for generating intense emotions. People like the Deshays twins, born conjoined and capable of inspiring both horror and fascination. Or like Carmina Mora, the artist whose work channeled deep pain and rebellion. These cult members understand, perhaps better than most, what the entity is and what it wants. They serve it not out of fear alone, but out of a twisted sense of purpose. Some believe that by facilitating the entity's feeding, they will be spared when it eventually consumes their world. Others seek power, hoping that faithful service will be rewarded with gifts beyond mortal comprehension. Still others have become true believers in a dark theology that sees the entity as a god worthy of worship, a cosmic force that represents some fundamental truth about the universe. That suffering is the only constant, that fear is the only honest emotion, that the darkness between the stars is the only reality that matters. What's particularly disturbing about the entity's relationship with human worship is how patient it has been in cultivating this relationship. It didn't simply appear and demand devotion. It waited, observed, learned what motivated humans to submit themselves to something greater than themselves. It studied our religions, our mythologies, our desperate need to find meaning in a chaotic universe. And then it provided that meaning, twisted though it may be. It became the God that some humans were looking for. Terrible, yes, but at least real, at least present, at least offering a clear purpose to those who would serve it. In a universe that often seems random and meaningless, the entity offers certainty. The price of that certainty is simply everything. As the entity observed humanity across countless worlds and countless ages, it was learning other things as well. It was learning about emotional mechanics, about the specific circumstances that produced the strongest, most sustainable fear responses. Pure terror, it discovered, burned bright but brief. Victims who were simply hunted and killed provided a burst of fear, certainly, but nothing lasting. Despair, the complete absence of hope, was similarly limited. A being in absolute despair, convinced that escape or relief is impossible, eventually numbs itself to feeling anything at all. The entity learned that what it needed was not one extreme or the other, but a careful balance between the two. It needed hope and fear, intertwined, each amplifying the other in an endless cycle. This understanding would eventually lead to the creation of the trials as we know them, but we're not quite there yet in our chronology. First, the entity needed to develop other skills, other techniques for interacting with and manipulating reality. It needed to learn how to create and sustain pocket dimensions, how to pull specific individuals from their home realities without collapsing the entire universe, how to preserve beings in a state between life and death, forever dying but never quite dead. These are not simple tricks of cosmic power. They require an intimate understanding of how reality functions at its most fundamental level. The entity became a student of physics, of metaphysics, of consciousness itself. Somewhere in this vast stretch of time, the entity also learned to communicate after a fashion. Its natural mode of existence doesn't involve language as we understand it. Words are linear, sequential, bound by the limitations of human throat and tongue and ear. The entity thinks in patterns, in impressions, in pure concepts that bypass language entirely. But it discovered that to manipulate humans effectively, to cultivate them as emotional crops, it needed to speak to them in ways they could comprehend, or at least partially comprehend. The whisper that Adiris heard in Babylon, the voices that speak to certain killers in the realm, these are the entity learning to use language as a tool. The words themselves matter less than the intention behind them, the meaning that bypasses conscious understanding and speaks directly to the deeper, more primitive parts of the human brain. The entity also learned the value of symbolism, of imagery that resonates with human psychology. The spider motif that appears throughout its realm, the claws and hooks and webs, these are not arbitrary choices. They tap into primal human fears that evolved over millions of years. Fears of being caught, bound, devoured by something with too many legs and too many eyes. The entity itself probably looks nothing like a spider, may not even have a true form in any sense we would recognize, but it learned that presenting itself through this imagery, allowing humans to perceive it through this lens, generated more fear, more of the delicious emotional energy it craved. It became what humans expected their monsters to be, because that made it more effective at its ultimate purpose. By the time the entity began creating the realm in earnest, it had accumulated knowledge from countless encounters with countless civilizations across the multiverse. It had seen species rise and fall, had witnessed the birth and death of entire worlds, had studied the patterns of consciousness with the dedication of a being that has nothing but time. Every primitive human it had frightened, every ancient civilization that had worshipped it, every cult member who had served its purposes, all of these encounters had been lessons, data points in a grand experiment. The entity was ready to build something permanent, something that could sustain it forever. It was ready to create its masterpiece, a realm where emotions could be harvested as efficiently as wheat in a field, where fear and hope could be cultivated and collected in perfect, endless balance. The ancient being that had drifted through the cosmic void for uncountable eons was about to become a farmer, and its crop would be human suffering, seasoned with just enough hope to keep it fresh, to keep it potent, to keep it flowing forever. To understand the entity, we must first grapple with a fundamental problem. What exactly is it? Not in the philosophical sense of its purpose or nature, but in the most basic physical sense. What form does it take? How does it manifest? What would you see if you could somehow perceive it directly, stripped of all the layers of symbolism and psychological projection? The answers to these questions are frustratingly elusive, pieced together from fragmentary observations, contradictory accounts, and the ravings of those who claim to have glimpsed its true nature. What emerges is a picture of something that exists in multiple states. Simultaneously, something that defies our understanding of form and matter. The most common description of the entity's physical manifestation is simple: fog. Not ordinary fog, not the water vapor that rises from warm ground on cool mornings, but something darker, thicker, more purposeful. The fog, as it's known to those trapped in the realm, is everywhere and nowhere. A constant presence that marks the boundaries of the entity's influence. Survivors speak of it rolling in when they least expect it, swallowing them whole, transporting them from one trial to another. Killers describe moving through it, feeling its weight against their skin like cobwebs or silk. The fog is not simply environment or atmosphere. It is the entity itself, or at least one manifestation of it, one way in which it chooses to present itself to conscious minds. But fog is inherently formless, shapeless, impossible to grasp or hold or truly perceive. This suits the entity perfectly. As a being that exists partially outside normal reality, that dwells in the spaces between universes, true form might be a contradiction in terms. What is the shape of something that has no fixed location in space? What is the texture of something that exists in 5 or 6 or 7 dimensions, only 3 of which human senses can perceive? The entity as fog makes a certain terrible sense. Fog is the visible manifestation of something invisible, the physical representation of something that has no physical form. It's the entity making itself perceptible to beings whose senses operate on a completely different level than its own existence. The fog itself has qualities that mark it as unnatural, as something more than mere water vapor. Those who have experienced it describe it as cold, yes, but not the clean cold of winter air. It's a deeper cold, something that seems to seep into bones and settle there. A cold that feels ancient and patient and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The texture is wrong too. Too thick, almost viscous, like moving through liquid that is almost but not quite solidified. Some describe feeling resistance when moving through it, as if it's reluctant to let them pass, as if it's testing them, tasting them, learning from every particle of their being that brushes against it. The color of the fog varies depending on who's describing it and under what circumstances. Most commonly, it's described as dark, a deep gray or black that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. But there are accounts of other colors bleeding through: sickly greens, deep purples, occasionally flashes of red like blood in water. These color shifts seem to correlate with the entity's emotional state, if such a being can be said to have emotions. During trials, when the entity is particularly satisfied, when fear and hope are balanced perfectly, and the harvest of emotions is rich, the fog sometimes takes on an almost luminous quality, as if lit from within by some terrible satisfaction. When things go wrong, when survivors work too efficiently together, or when a killer fails to generate sufficient fear, the fog darkens, becomes heavier, more oppressive. But the entity is not merely fog. Those who have looked deeper, who have survived long enough in the realm to see beyond the surface, report other manifestations. The most commonly reported are the claws, massive, spider-like appendages that descend from above when a survivor is hooked. These are not metaphorical. Survivors describe them in terrifying detail, chitinous and black, segmented like insect legs, but impossibly large, each one thick as a tree trunk, tapering to points sharp enough to pierce steel. They move with purpose and intelligence, reaching down from somewhere beyond the fog, from some higher dimension or deeper reality, to claim their prize. The hooks themselves are mere anchor points. The claws are the entity's true hands, reaching into its realm to directly collect what it has cultivated. The appearance of these claws raises profound questions about the entity's true form. Are they actually spider legs? Or is that simply the shape human minds impose on something our brains cannot process? The spider imagery is too consistent, appearing not just in the claws, but throughout the realm, in web-like structures, in the overall architecture of certain locations, in the way the entity seems to wait with infinite patience at the center of its creation. But scholars of the entity's nature suggest this might be a form of cosmic pareidolia. Humans see faces in clouds, patterns in random noise. Perhaps we see spiders in the entity simply because that's the closest match our evolutionary psychology can provide for something that hunts, that waits, that ensnares its prey in carefully constructed traps. Some accounts suggest the entity has revealed itself more directly, though these reports are rare and often unreliable, coming from individuals whose sanity has been thoroughly compromised by their time in the realm. The Observer, in one of his more disturbed entries, described a vision of something vast and terrible, a shape that hurt to perceive, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his eyes could process. He used words like angles that shouldn't exist, darkness that projects light, hunger given geometry. His description dissolves into incoherence after that, suggesting that direct perception of the entity's true form might be beyond human cognitive capacity, that to truly see it would be to break something fundamental in the architecture of consciousness. There are also the occasions when the entity manifests more subtly, more symbolically. The hooks that dot every trial location, for instance, are these truly physical objects, or are they manifestations of the entity's will made solid? They appear and disappear as needed, are indestructible despite appearing to be made of ordinary metal, and seem to exist in a quantum state where they're simultaneously tools and living parts of the entity itself. When a survivor is hung on a hook, they're not simply being suspended in place. They're being fed into the entity, becoming part of its being in a way that transcends normal physical interaction. The hook is both altar and feeding tube, both symbolic sacrifice and practical mechanism for consumption. The entity's ability to manifest physically within its realm extends beyond claws and hooks. There are reports of more dramatic interventions, walls of solid shadow blocking paths, bridges forming from nothing when the entity wishes to guide or herd its subjects, entire sections of reality restructuring themselves in response to its will. These manifestations demonstrate something crucial about the entity's nature. Within its realm, it is reality itself. The fog isn't just its body. The ground beneath survivors' feet, the walls around them, the sky above. All of it exists because the entity wills it to exist, maintains it as part of its greater purpose. To be in the realm is to exist inside the entity in some very literal sense. This raises the question of scale. How large is the entity? If the realm exists within it or as an extension of it, and the realm contains multiple full-sized maps, each one a recreation of sprawling locations like farms and asylums and abandoned towns, then the entity must be vast beyond comprehension. Yet it can also manifest as something small and precise. A single claw descending, a particular pattern in the fog, a whisper in a specific person's ear. It exists at all scales, simultaneously, like a fractal where each part contains the whole, where the smallest manifestation and the largest are equally real, equally true representations of what it is. The entity's formlessness serves multiple purposes beyond simply existing in a way that human senses struggle to perceive. It's a defensive mechanism, in a sense. How do you fight something that has no body to strike, no vital points to target, no physical form that can be damaged? Even if someone in the realm possessed a weapon capable of harming the entity, and it's unclear what such a weapon would even look like, how would they use it? Would you stab the fog? Strike at the claws, knowing they're just extensions of something much larger? The entity's lack of fixed form makes it essentially invulnerable to any physical attack, any conventional means of resistance or rebellion. But beyond defense, formlessness provides flexibility. The entity can be everywhere in its realm at once, observing every trial simultaneously, feeling every spike of fear and surge of hope as they occur. It doesn't need to choose where to focus its attention, because it exists at all points in its domain simultaneously. This omnipresence is crucial to its farming operation. A farmer needs to monitor their crops constantly, watching for problems, identifying which plants are thriving and which are failing. The entity does this across dozens or hundreds or possibly thousands of simultaneous trials, each one a separate field requiring its own particular care and attention. The formlessness also allows for adaptation. When the entity encounters something new, a particularly resistant survivor, a killer whose psychology requires special handling, an unexpected development in a trial, it can reshape itself to address the situation. It's not bound by biology, by the limitations that evolution imposes on creatures made of flesh and bone and fixed genetic code. The entity is pure adaptability, capable of becoming whatever it needs to be to achieve its goals. This might explain why different survivors and killers report perceiving it differently. It's not that they're hallucinating or misremembering. They're each seeing the face the entity chooses to show them, the manifestation most effective for manipulating that particular individual. Moving beyond the question of form, we must consider the entity's powers, the actual capabilities it possesses, and how it uses them to maintain its realm and harvest the emotions it requires. These powers are vast, varied, and deeply disturbing in their implications. At the most fundamental level, the entity is a reality warper, capable of bending the laws of physics to its will within its domain. This isn't mere stage magic, tricks of misdirection, and clever engineering. The entity can genuinely reshape reality, creating matter from nothing, altering the flow of time, breaking fundamental rules about causality and conservation of energy. The most obvious demonstration of this power is the realm itself. The entity has created entire pocket dimensions, small universes that exist separately from normal reality, but remain connected to it through the fog. Each map in the realm, the Macmillan Estate, the Red Forest, Haddonfield, all the others, represents a reality bubble, a self-contained space that exists because the entity maintains it. These aren't merely buildings or landscapes that the entity constructed. They are complete realities, with their own internal consistency, their own physical laws that generally mirror those of normal reality, but can be suspended whenever the entity desires. Creating and maintaining these pocket dimensions requires power on a scale difficult to comprehend. Each realm must be kept stable, prevented from collapsing back into the void from which it was carved. The physical structures must be preserved, the atmospheres maintained, the countless details that make each location feel real must be sustained continuously. And the entity does this for dozens of different realms simultaneously, each one as detailed and complex as the last. It's the equivalent of an artist painting dozens of separate masterpieces simultaneously, never losing focus, never making a mistake that would cause the illusion to crumble. But the entity's reality manipulation goes deeper than simple construction and maintenance. It can alter these spaces on the fly, responding to the needs of each trial. Exit gates appear where none existed before. Generators spawn in locations that make tactical sense for that particular trial. Pallets and windows manifest in patterns that provide just enough resources for survivors to have hope of escape, but not so many that the killer is overwhelmed. This dynamic adjustment happens constantly, invisibly, with such precision that most survivors don't even realize they're not experiencing a fixed, unchanging environment. The entity is like a dungeon master in a role-playing game, adjusting the scenario in real time to maintain perfect balance between challenge and possibility. The entity's power over time is equally impressive and far more disturbing. Within the realm, time flows differently than in normal reality, or rather, it flows however the entity wishes it to flow. Survivors and killers can experience what feels like years of trials. Yet when someone new is pulled into the realm, they might encounter someone who was taken decades earlier, appearing exactly as they did on the day of their abduction. Time in the realm is cyclical, looping, disconnected from the linear progression that governs normal reality. This allows the entity to stretch its harvest indefinitely. The same survivors can experience fear hundreds or thousands of times, each cycle providing fresh emotional energy without the resource ever truly being depleted. This temporal manipulation also explains one of the realm's most horrifying features: the inability to truly die. Survivors are hooked, sacrificed, consumed by the entity. And yet moments later, they're back at the campfire, whole and unharmed. Killers can kill the same survivor over and over, and each time, the survivor's fear is genuine, their pain real. The entity has created a loop where death is not an ending, but merely a transition, a reset button that allows the same emotional notes to be played again and again. This isn't resurrection in any traditional sense. The entity isn't bringing the dead back to life. It's simply refusing to let them die in the first place, holding them in a state where death approaches but never quite arrives and is immediately rewound. Memory manipulation is another of the entity's crucial powers, though this one is somewhat controversial among scholars of the realm. Some accounts suggest that survivors' memories are wiped between trials, that each time they wake at the campfire, they have no recollection of previous experiences. This would explain why the same survivors continue to feel fear trial after trial, despite having survived countless times before. Familiarity breeds contempt, as they say, and the entity cannot afford for its crops to become too familiar with the harvest. Fresh fear requires fresh circumstances, and what could be fresher than experiencing something for the first time every single time? However, other evidence contradicts the complete memory wipe theory. Survivors seem to learn and improve, developing skills and strategies that can only come from accumulated experience. They recognize each other, form relationships, develop personalities that respond to their shared circumstances. Some survivors, like those who have studied under Vigo or learned from Benedict Baker's teachings, clearly retain knowledge across multiple trials. The truth seems to be more nuanced than simple amnesia. The entity can manipulate memory, certainly, dulling certain recollections, sharpening others, creating false memories, or removing true ones as needed. But it doesn't erase everything, because some continuity of experience is necessary for survivors to remain emotionally engaged, to continue hoping and fearing, and feeling all the complex emotions that make them valuable to the entity. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entity's power is its ability to manipulate perception directly. The white eyes that certain killers display, Spirit, Wraith, Deathslinger, Doctor, are believed to be markers of active perceptual manipulation. The entity is reaching into these killers' minds and altering what they see, what they perceive when they look at survivors. Spirit sees her father's face on every survivor she hunts, feeding her endless rage and need for vengeance. Deathslinger sees the men who wronged him, the corrupt officials and betrayers who destroyed his life, making every hook and every injury a personal revenge. The entity has learned that generic violence is less emotionally charged than personal violence, so it provides each killer with personal motivation, creating a layer of meaning that amplifies the emotional output on both sides. This perceptual manipulation extends to survivors as well, though in subtler ways. There's evidence that survivors sometimes perceive the realm differently than it actually is, seeing things that comfort them or disturb them based on what will generate the strongest emotional response. A survivor might see a familiar landmark from their home, a person they loved waiting in the fog, a glimpse of safety that drives them forward with desperate hope. These visions aren't necessarily complete hallucinations. The entity is skilled enough to work with ambiguity, to create situations where interpretation varies, where what one person sees as threatening another might see as promising. The realm becomes a Rorschach test, with the entity carefully observing which interpretations generate the strongest emotions. The entity's control over life and death extends beyond simple resurrection. It can preserve beings in states that should be impossible. Consider the plague, her body ravaged by disease, pustules covering her skin, vomit pouring from her mouth. Yet she doesn't die, doesn't succumb to the infection that should have killed her days or weeks after manifesting. The entity holds her in this state of perpetual sickness, keeping the disease active enough to be a weapon, but not so active that it destroys its host. The same is true for injured killers like the Hag, who was tortured and partially consumed by cannibals, or the Trapper, whose body bears the marks of years of abuse. The entity preserves them exactly as they were at their moment of greatest trauma, frozen in time like insects in amber. This preservation even extends to parts of beings, fragments separated from the whole. The iridescent add-ons that killers can use often contain pieces of people or things from their past. Locks of hair, fragments of bone, shreds of clothing. These aren't merely souvenirs or trophies. The entity has the power to keep these fragments alive in some sense, to maintain the connection between the part and the whole, even after physical separation. The add-ons that reference specific people, like Bubba's add-ons mentioning Pam, suggest that pieces of these individuals might exist within the objects, preserved by the entity's power, providing some enhanced capability to the killer who uses them. The entity can also communicate, though its methods of communication are as alien as everything else about it. It doesn't speak in language, not exactly. When survivors or killers report hearing the entity's voice, they're interpreting something more fundamental than words. The entity communicates through impressions, through concepts that bypass language entirely and speak directly to the deeper parts of consciousness. When Plague heard the whisper that convinced her to kill her mentor, she didn't hear a sentence in Akkadian or any other language. She perceived something that her brain interpreted as communication, a meaning that arrived fully formed without the intermediary step of words. This communication seems to be tailored to each recipient. The entity knows what each person needs to hear, what concepts will resonate with their particular psychology. It speaks to the plague in the language of religious devotion, framing service to itself as divine calling. It speaks to killers like the Huntress in the simple terms of hunting and territory, concepts her limited understanding can grasp. To more sophisticated minds like the Doctor or the Trickster, it might communicate in more complex terms, appealing to their specific interests and desires. The entity is a polyglot speaking every language, or perhaps more accurately, it bypasses language entirely to communicate pure meaning. The voice that survivors hear, when they hear anything at all beyond the ambient whispers that pervade the realm, seems to be different from what killers hear. Survivors report sounds of breathing, of something vast moving through the darkness. Occasionally, single words or fragments of sentences that might be warnings or threats, or simply the entity thinking aloud in a way that leaks into perceptible reality. These sounds are rarely helpful, never providing clear guidance or information. They're designed to unsettle, to remind survivors that they're always being watched, that the realm itself is alive and aware of their presence. Among the entity's most significant powers is its ability to reach between dimensions, to create the overlaps and connections that allow it to pull new victims into its realm. This requires a delicate touch, a precise application of force at exactly the right moment. The entity can't simply tear holes in reality at will, or if it can, it chooses not to, presumably because such crude methods would damage the universes it's trying to harvest from. Instead, it works slowly, patiently, creating weak points in the fabric of reality, places where its realm and normal reality press close together. These are the overlaps, the places where the fog bleeds through, where the entity's influence can be felt in the normal world. Creating an overlap requires the entity to focus its attention on a specific point in space and time, usually a location that's already saturated with intense emotion. Sites of terrible tragedy, places where many people have suffered, locations with dark histories, these become natural candidates for overlaps. The entity doesn't need to create the emotional resonance. It's already there, carved into the location by human suffering. The entity simply uses that existing emotional signature as a foundation, building its overlap on top of trauma that has already weakened the barriers between worlds. Once an overlap is established, the entity can manipulate events within it, pushing things toward greater catastrophe, encouraging the cycle of suffering to accelerate. It's like a farmer tilling soil, preparing the ground for planting. The entity creates conditions that will produce the maximum emotional harvest, then waits for the right individuals to enter the overlap. When someone with sufficient emotional potential, a traumatized person, someone connected to the location's dark history, someone whose presence will generate intense fear or rage or despair, enters the overlap, the entity can then pull them through, drawing them from normal reality into the realm. This process isn't instant or simple. The entity must be patient, sometimes maintaining an overlap for years or decades before the right candidate appears. But time means nothing to an immortal being. The entity can wait for centuries if necessary, confident that eventually, someone useful will stumble into its trap. And when they do, when the moment is exactly right, the fog rolls in, reality blurs, and another victim finds themselves standing in an impossible place, surrounded by darkness, hearing the heartbeat that signals their hunter's approach. But for all its vast powers, the entity is not omnipotent, not truly all-powerful. There are limits, constraints that even this cosmic horror must observe. The most significant limitation seems to be territorial. The entity's absolute power is confined to its realm, to the pocket dimensions it has created. Outside those boundaries, in normal reality, its influence is far more limited. It can whisper. It can manipulate. It can create overlaps and pull victims through, but it cannot directly reshape reality the way it does within its domain. The laws of physics that it can break inside the realm remain frustratingly solid outside it. This territorial limitation explains why the entity bothers with the complex process of creating overlaps and luring victims rather than simply appearing in normal reality and taking whoever it wants. It can't exist fully in normal reality, or if it can, doing so would require more energy than it's worth. The entity is adapted to existence between dimensions, in the spaces where normal physical laws grow thin and malleable. Manifesting fully in a normal universe would be like a deep-sea creature trying to live on land. Technically possible, perhaps, but exhausting, inefficient, ultimately self-defeating. The realm is the entity's natural habitat, the place where it's strongest and most capable. Another limit seems to involve direct confrontation with certain types of power or knowledge. The entity is cautious around those who have learned to manipulate the fog themselves, individuals like Vigo or Benedict Baker, who have discovered ways to use the entity's own tools against it. The entity doesn't directly confront these individuals, doesn't manifest to stop them personally. Instead, it seems to work around them, contain them, limit their influence through indirect means. This suggests that direct confrontation might be risky for the entity, that those who truly understand its nature might possess some ability to harm or resist it. The entity's power over time, while vast, also seems to have limits. It can loop time within specific areas, can reset individuals to previous states, but there's evidence that this process isn't perfectly efficient. Survivors grow weary over time despite the resets. Killers seem to change subtly, accumulating something that could be called experience, or perhaps degradation. The entity might be able to manipulate time, but it can't truly stop it, can't prevent the eventual entropy that affects all things. This might explain why the entity constantly needs new victims, not just for variety, but because the old ones eventually wear out, losing their capacity to generate the intense emotions the entity requires. Finally, there are hints that the entity's intelligence, while vast and alien, is not unlimited. It makes mistakes, fails to predict certain outcomes, sometimes underestimates its subjects. The fact that individuals like Vigo managed to create the hatch, that survivors have developed strategies for working together effectively, that some killers seem to resist their programming, all of this suggests imperfect control, gaps in the entity's understanding or capability. It's immensely powerful, but it's not a god in the traditional sense. It can be surprised. It can be thwarted, at least temporarily. And perhaps most importantly, it can be studied, understood, its patterns identified, and its methods anticipated. This vulnerability, however slight, is what gives hope to those trapped in its realm. The possibility that perfect understanding might lead to perfect escape. The entity's realm did not spring into existence fully formed, a complete nightmare descending upon the multiverse in a single moment. Instead, it was built, crafted over time, with the same patient care a master architect might devote to designing a cathedral. But where a cathedral is meant to inspire worship through beauty, the realm is designed to generate emotion through carefully calibrated suffering. Every element serves a purpose. Every detail contributes to the entity's ultimate goal of sustainable emotional harvest. To understand the realm is to understand the mind of something truly alien, a consciousness that views fear and hope not as experiences, but as resources to be managed. At the heart of the realm's construction lies the fog itself, that thick, dark mist that permeates everything, that serves as boundary, barrier, and medium all at once. The fog is not merely decoration or atmosphere. It is the fundamental substance from which everything else in the realm is built, the clay from which the entity sculpts its nightmare. Think of it as the entity's own essence, made tangible, spread thin across the pocket dimensions it has created, connecting them all in a network of darkness. The fog is everywhere in the realm, because the fog is the realm, in a very real sense. Everything else, the maps, the structures, the survivors, and killers themselves, exists within the fog like objects suspended in liquid. The properties of the fog are unlike any natural substance. It serves as both barrier and passage, both wall and doorway depending on the entity's will. When survivors complete their trial and stumble toward the exit gates, they pass through the fog and find themselves back at the campfire, transported instantly across whatever distance separates these locations. When killers enter their trials, they emerge from the fog as if it were a curtain parting on a stage. The fog doesn't follow normal rules about matter or space. It exists in multiple locations simultaneously, connects points that have no physical relationship to each other, allows the entity to move its subjects around the realm like pieces on a board. But the fog also serves a psychological purpose, one that might be even more important than its practical functions. It represents the unknown, the unseen, the ever-present possibility of threat or salvation. Survivors moving through a trial can never see very far ahead. The fog limits their vision, creates pockets of uncertainty where anything might be lurking. This constant limitation on perception generates a baseline anxiety that never quite fades. A tension that makes every moment in the realm uncomfortable, even when no immediate danger is present. The human mind craves information, wants to see what's coming, needs to feel secure in its understanding of its surroundings. The fog denies all of that, creating perpetual unease that the entity can taste like fine wine. The fog also obscures the boundaries of the realm's pocket dimensions, hiding the edges where reality simply stops. If survivors could see clearly to the borders of each map, they would witness something that might break their minds. The place where existence terminates, where the carefully constructed reality dissolves back into void. The fog prevents this, maintaining the illusion that each location is part of a larger world, that beyond the trial area, there exists something more than infinite darkness. This preservation of the illusion is crucial. If survivors fully understood the artificial nature of their environment, the carefully maintained balance between hope and despair might collapse. They might give up entirely, realizing escape is impossible. Or they might become immune to fear through complete understanding of their situation. Beyond the fog lies something else, something darker and more final. The void has existed in the entity's realm for as long as the realm itself, serving as a dumping ground for what the entity no longer needs or wants. Early on, scholars of the entity's nature assumed the void was simply empty space, the darkness between the pocket dimensions where nothing existed. But more recent evidence suggests the void is something far stranger and more terrible, a place of active emptiness, a region where beings persist in a state beyond death, beyond hope, beyond anything that could be called existence in any meaningful sense. The void appears to be where the entity discards survivors who have lost their capacity to generate useful emotions. When someone has been in the realm too long, when they've experienced the cycle of death and resurrection so many times that fear no longer registers. When hope has been ground away by endless repetition, the entity has no more use for them. But the entity doesn't release them back to their home realities, doesn't grant them the mercy of true death. Instead, they're cast into the void, dropped into that emptiness to drift forever in a state that's somehow worse than the trials themselves. Those who have glimpsed the void describe it as a place of profound wrongness, a space where the normal rules about existence don't merely bend, but cease to apply entirely. There's no ground, no sky, no up or down. Beings float in absolute darkness, unable to interact with anything, unable to feel anything except the knowledge that they still somehow exist. They can't die because death is a transition, and there's nowhere to transition to. They can't sleep because sleep implies the possibility of waking. They simply are, eternally aware of their own existence, but incapable of affecting anything or experiencing anything beyond that bare awareness. It's a fate that makes the trials look like paradise by comparison. The void's relationship to the realm proper has grown more complex over time. Recent evidence suggests the void is expanding, bleeding into the trial spaces, manifesting as strange growths and anomalies on various maps. The most dramatic example is the massive organic structure that has appeared above the Macmillan estate, a twisted growth that looks like it's forcing its way through from somewhere else. This growth is hollow inside, and those who have ventured into it report entering a space that feels like the void itself. Empty, silent, wrong in ways that defy description. The entity seems unable or unwilling to remove these intrusions, suggesting that the void might be developing a will of its own, or that the entity's control over its realm is not as absolute as it once was. The relationship between fog and void represents a dualism at the heart of the entity's realm. The fog is active, purposeful, the entity's tool for shaping reality and managing its subjects. The void is passive, final, the place where things go to be forgotten. Together they form the boundaries of existence within the realm. The fog as the medium of active experience, the void as the destination of those who have exhausted their usefulness. Survivors exist somewhere between these two states, suspended in the fog, always at risk of being cast into the void if they fail to continue generating the emotions the entity craves. But between fog and void, the entity has constructed something more complex, the trials themselves. These are the entity's masterwork, the carefully designed scenarios where emotions are actually harvested. The structure of a trial appears deceptively simple on the surface. Survivors must repair generators to power exit gates while a killer hunts them. But this simplicity conceals profound psychological sophistication. Every element of the trial structure serves multiple purposes, creating a system that's self-balancing, endlessly replayable, and perfectly calibrated to generate maximum emotional output. The generators are perhaps the most crucial element of the trial structure, and their importance goes far beyond their ostensible purpose of powering the gates. On a practical level, the generators give survivors something to do, a goal to work toward, a sense of agency in a situation that might otherwise be pure helplessness. But more importantly, the generators serve as hope generators in the most literal sense. When a survivor works on a generator, they're making progress toward escape. The percentage indicator ticking upward, the sound of the engine growing louder, the lights beginning to glow. All of this feeds hope, creates the feeling that escape is possible, that effort matters, that this nightmare might have an end. The entity could have chosen any number of different mechanisms for determining trial outcomes. It could have made escape random, based on pure chance. It could have required some impossible task that survivors could never complete. But both of those approaches would fail. To generate the right emotional balance, pure chance provides no hope because effort doesn't matter. An impossible task initially generates hope, but eventually leads to despair as survivors realize the futility of their attempts. The generators are calibrated perfectly, difficult enough that completing them requires genuine effort and coordination, easy enough that success is realistically achievable. This balance means hope persists throughout the trial, waxing and waning but never quite dying. The number of generators required is itself significant. 5 generators to power the gates, but 7 scattered across each map. This creates an element of choice, of strategy. Survivors must decide which generators to prioritize, must sometimes abandon progress on one generator to start another. These choices create investment, make survivors feel like they're actively participating in their own salvation, rather than merely going through predetermined motions. The entity understands something fundamental about human psychology. We value most what we work for. A gift creates gratitude, but an achievement creates pride, ownership, deeper emotional engagement. By making survivors work for their escape, the entity ensures they care deeply about the outcome. The repair process itself is designed to maintain tension. Generators require sustained attention, force survivors to remain stationary and vulnerable for extended periods. The skill checks add an element of randomness, moments when focus is tested, and failure means lost progress, plus an alert to the killer. These skill checks serve multiple purposes. They prevent generator repair from becoming purely mechanical, requiring ongoing attention rather than allowing minds to wander. They create moments of spike tension when the skill check appears, followed by either relief at success or fear at failure. And they provide the killer with information, ensuring that survivors can't simply hide and repair in complete safety. The exit gates represent the culmination of the generator mechanic, the moment when accumulated effort translates into genuine possibility of escape. But the entity's sophistication shows in how the gates themselves function. 2 gates spawn in each trial, positioned according to logic that balances accessibility with risk. The gates must be opened through another sustained action, another period of vulnerability where survivors must commit to a location and hope the killer doesn't interrupt. This creates a climactic moment of tension, where success is close enough to taste but not yet guaranteed, where hope reaches its peak while simultaneously fear spikes at the possibility of failure at the last moment. The entity's genius is most apparent in what happens when the gates are opened. Escape becomes possible, truly possible, and survivors who pass through those gates do escape the trial. They're not caught by some last-minute trick, not punished for their success. The entity allows genuine escape because genuine escape is necessary for genuine hope. If survivors never escaped, if the gates were merely a cruel joke, they would learn quickly that effort is meaningless. Hope would die, replaced by that useless despair the entity cannot feed upon. But because escape is real, because survivors sometimes make it out, hope persists even through dozens or hundreds or thousands of failed attempts. Yet escape from a trial is not escape from the realm. Survivors who make it through the gates find themselves back at the campfire, right where they started, ready to be thrown into another trial. The entity has created a perfect loop where success and failure lead to the same ultimate destination. Survivors who die on hooks are consumed by the entity and respawn at the campfire. Survivors who escape through the gates also end up at the campfire. The only difference is the emotional journey that led to each outcome, and that journey is precisely what the entity values. The destination matters far less than the emotions experienced along the way. Then there is the hatch, that strange anomaly in the trial structure that seems to break the rules the entity has established. The hatch appears when specific conditions are met, usually when only one survivor remains and a certain number of generators have been completed, or when all other survivors have been killed or escaped. It provides an alternative escape route, a way out that doesn't require opening the gates, that bypasses the normal requirements for escape. The hatch is mysterious, its origins unclear, though tradition attributes its creation to Vigo, that enigmatic figure who supposedly mastered the fog and found ways to manipulate the entity's own realm against it. The existence of the hatch raises profound questions about the entity's control over its domain. If Vigo created the hatch, if a mere human managed to alter the fundamental structure of the trials, then the entity's power is not absolute. It can be circumvented, its rules rewritten by those with sufficient knowledge and skill. Yet the entity allows the hatch to persist, hasn't removed this anomaly, despite having had ample time to do so. This suggests either the entity cannot remove the hatch, which implies limitations to its power that might be exploitable, or it chooses not to remove it because the hatch serves some purpose in the entity's larger design. Perhaps the hatch serves as an additional source of hope. Its appearance is unpredictable, creates moments where a survivor who seemed doomed suddenly has a chance at escape. The desperate search for the hatch when you're the last one alive. The racing heartbeat as you try to find it before the killer finds you. The surge of hope when you spot it and rush toward it. These create intense emotional spikes that the entity can feed upon. The hatch makes the endgame of trials more dynamic, prevents scenarios where the outcome is predetermined from playing out in boring, emotionally flat ways. Like everything else in the realm, what appears to be a mercy might simply be another tool for emotional manipulation. The hooks scattered throughout every trial location are perhaps the most overtly sinister element of the entity's design. These crude metal structures serve as the primary method by which the entity claims its victims, the mechanisms through which survivors are literally fed to the darkness that hunts them. When a survivor is hung on a hook, they're not simply being restrained or punished. Something more fundamental is happening. The entity's claws descend, those massive spider-like appendages reaching down from some higher dimension, and they begin to consume the survivor, to draw them upward and into the entity's being. The process is gradual, divided into distinct phases that create their own emotional rhythm. The first time a survivor is hooked, they have time. They can struggle, can hope for rescue, can watch as teammates potentially risk themselves to save them. This first hook state is pure tension, pain from the hook itself, fear of the entity's claws descending, desperate hope that rescue will come before it's too late, anxiety about whether teammates will abandon them to save themselves. The entity feeds on all of these emotions simultaneously, making each hooking a feast of complex, layered emotional responses. The second hook state intensifies everything. The survivor knows they're closer to death now, that the entity's patience is wearing thin. The fear becomes more acute, the hope more desperate. Teammates who might have risked a rescue on first hook often hesitate at second hook, knowing the danger is greater, the margin for error smaller. This creates a different flavor of emotional output. Survivors on hook feel abandonment, anxiety, anger at teammates who won't rescue, bitter acceptance of approaching death. Teammates feel guilt for not rescuing, fear for their own safety, the complex calculus of sacrificing one to save others. The entity feeds on all of it, missing nothing. The third hook state is final. When a survivor reaches this phase, when they've been hooked 3 times total across the trial, the entity's patience ends. The claws descend one last time, and the survivor is pulled upward, consumed utterly, sacrificed to the entity's hunger. They disappear from the trial, removed from play, sent back to the campfire to await the next trial. This finality serves an important purpose in the trial structure. It creates real stakes, real consequences for failure. If survivors could be hooked infinite times without permanent removal from the trial, the emotional weight of each hooking would diminish. But knowing that 3 hooks mean death, that each hooking brings you closer to removal, creates escalating tension that the entity requires. The hooks themselves are indestructible, immovable, perfectly positioned to create strategic complexity. The entity places them throughout each map with careful consideration for sight lines, distances from generators, accessibility to both killers and survivors. Too many hooks and killers would have an overwhelming advantage, able to hook survivors anywhere they down them. Too few hooks and killers would struggle to reach hooks before survivors wiggled free. The current distribution creates tension on both sides. Killers must sometimes decide whether to hook nearby and risk a quick rescue, or carry survivors farther to a more isolated hook, while survivors must balance the time cost of rescue against the strategic value of the hooked individual. The campfire sits at the center of it all, a space that exists outside the normal rules of the realm. When survivors aren't in trials, they gather here, sitting around this source of light and warmth that seems somehow pure, untainted by the entity's darkness. The campfire is sanctuary, the one place in the entire realm where survivors are truly safe, where the killers cannot reach them, where they can rest and recover between the horrors they endure. But the campfire is also prison, because there's nowhere else to go. Survivors cannot leave the campfire area. They're confined here between trials, held in this small bubble of safety that's really just another form of cage. The entity's reasoning for providing this safe space becomes clearer when you consider the alternative. Without the campfire, without any period of respite, survivors would quickly burn out. Fear cannot be maintained at peak intensity indefinitely. The human mind adapts, numbs itself, shuts down when subjected to constant terror without relief. The campfire allows survivors to recover their emotional capacity, to process what they've experienced, to rebuild their sense of self, enough that they can feel fear intensely again in the next trial. It's the fallow period in the entity's farming operation, the time when the field rests so it can produce another crop. But the campfire serves another purpose as well. It provides hope of a different kind, social hope, the comfort of human connection in an inhuman place. Survivors can see each other at the campfire, can communicate if the entity permits it, can form bonds and relationships that make them care about each other's survival. This caring is valuable to the entity because it amplifies emotional responses. A survivor who watches a stranger get hooked experiences fear and perhaps sympathy. A survivor who watches a friend get hooked experiences all that plus deeper, more complex emotions. Guilt if they feel responsible, rage at the killer who hurt someone they care about, desperate determination to rescue someone who matters to them personally. The entity cultivates these relationships because relationships make emotions richer, more intense, more nourishing. The campfire's warmth and light stand in stark contrast to the fog and darkness that surround it, creating a symbolic center point for the survivor's existence. Fire has always meant safety to humans, dating back to our earliest days as a species. Fire meant warmth, protection from predators, the ability to cook food and see in the dark. Fire was civilization, community, hope. The entity provides this powerful symbol, allows survivors to gather around it, lets them feel that primitive sense of safety. But it's a lie, of course. or at least a partial lie. The safety is temporary, conditional, and in the end, the survivors are no closer to true escape than they were when they first arrived. The pocket dimensions that house the trials, the maps themselves, represent perhaps the most impressive aspect of the entity's realm construction. Each map is a fully realized environment, complete with detailed structures, atmospheric effects, and countless small touches that make them feel real. The Macmillan Estate, with its industrial ruins and coal mines, the Red Forest with its haunted village and twisted trees, the Crotus Pren Asylum with its decaying mental institution. Each location has been recreated, or perhaps stolen wholesale from reality, pulled into the entity's realm and preserved like specimens in jars. The origin of these maps raises fascinating questions. Are they reconstructions built by the entity based on memories of places that exist or existed in normal reality? Or are they the actual locations, physical spaces that have been torn from their home universes and transplanted into the realm? The evidence suggests something between these extremes. The maps seem to be based on real places. Haddonfield clearly corresponds to the town from the Halloween franchise. The meat plant echoes the setting from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But they're not perfect replicas. Details are wrong, geography doesn't quite match, things that should be present are missing or altered. This imperfection suggests the entity creates its maps based on memory and emotion rather than physical reality. It reaches into the minds of killers and survivors, extracting their memories and perceptions of significant locations, then uses those impressions as templates for construction. This explains why maps feel emotionally resonant to those who have connections to the real locations. They're literally built from emotional memory. The Macmillan Estate isn't just any industrial site. It's the Macmillan Estate as experienced by the trapper, filtered through his memories of abuse and eventual patricide. Haddonfield isn't just any suburban town. It's Haddonfield, as Laurie Strode remembers it, forever frozen in that Halloween night when Michael Myers came home. This memory-based construction serves multiple purposes for the entity. It creates environments that are emotionally charged for the killers who hunt there, increasing their engagement and thus their emotional output. A killer hunting through locations connected to their past, surrounded by reminders of their trauma or crimes, generates more intense emotions than one hunting through generic, meaningless spaces. The same is true for survivors who have connections to particular locations. Laurie in Haddonfield, Cheryl in the Midwich Elementary School. These personal connections to the environment add layers of meaning to the trials, making them psychological battlegrounds as much as physical ones. The attention to detail in map construction is remarkable. The entity doesn't simply create rough approximations of locations. It fills them with countless small objects, decorations, and touches that serve no gameplay purpose, but add to the atmosphere and sense of reality. Photographs on walls, papers scattered on desks, personal belongings left behind. These details suggest lives once lived, histories that preceded the entity's claiming of these spaces. Some of these details are random, atmospheric filler, but others seem intentional, telling stories for those who care to look, providing glimpses into the histories of killers or survivors or the locations themselves. The maps also serve practical purposes in the trial structure, providing the three-dimensional spaces where the cat and mouse game between killers and survivors plays out. Each map has its own layout, its own combination of structures and open spaces, its own particular strategic considerations. Some maps favor killers with their open sight lines and limited hiding spots. Others favor survivors with their complex layouts and numerous palettes for stunning killers. This variety keeps trials from becoming stale, forces both sides to adapt their strategies to the specific environment, creates different emotional textures across different trials. But perhaps the most important aspect of the maps is how they create the illusion of a larger world. When survivors work on generators in the rancid abattoir, they can see other buildings in the distance, structures beyond the playable area that suggest the trial space exists within something larger. When killers patrol the edges of the disturbed ward, they encounter not a visible wall but just more fog, implying that the map continues beyond where they can go. This illusion of extent is crucial for maintaining the emotional balance the entity requires. If survivors fully grasped that each trial takes place in an isolated bubble of reality, a small stage surrounded by void, the existential horror might overwhelm the immediate fear of being hunted, might push them toward that useless despair the entity cannot feed upon. The evolution of the realm over time suggests the entity is constantly learning, constantly refining its creation. New maps appear, added to the rotation, as the entity pulls new locations into its domain or creates new spaces based on new victims. The structure of trials has changed subtly over the years that the realm has existed, with new mechanics introduced, new elements added to the core gameplay loop. These changes suggest the entity is experimenting, testing different approaches to maximize emotional harvest. It's not content with static perfection, but seeks continuous improvement, making its realm more efficient, more sustainable, more finely calibrated to generate exactly the emotions it craves in exactly the quantities it requires. The entity's realm exists as a separate dimension, a pocket universe carved from void and sustained by will. But the entity does not wait passively for victims to stumble into its domain by chance. Instead, it reaches out across the infinite expanse of the multiverse, extending tendrils of influence into countless realities, creating connection points where its realm brushes against normal space. These connections are known by many names across many worlds: overlaps, folds, bleeds, borrows. Each term captures some aspect of their nature, but none quite encompasses the full horror of what they represent. Wounds in reality itself, places where the barrier between worlds grows thin enough for something terrible to seep through. An overlap is not simply a doorway or portal in the traditional sense. It's more subtle and more insidious than that. Imagine reality as a fabric, stretched tight across the framework of physical laws. Most of this fabric is strong, resilient, able to resist intrusion from outside forces. But certain locations, under certain circumstances, develop weak points. The fabric grows thin, begins to fray, becomes permeable to influences that should remain safely beyond its boundaries. These weak points are where overlaps form, where the entity can press its presence through from its realm into normal reality, creating zones where both worlds exist simultaneously, overlapping like images superimposed on the same photograph. The creation of an overlap is not a simple or instantaneous process. The entity cannot simply tear holes in reality wherever it wishes, or if it possesses such power, it chooses not to use it, presumably because crude force would damage the delicate structures it seeks to exploit. Instead, the entity works with subtlety and patience that only an immortal being can muster. It identifies locations with the right characteristics, the right emotional resonance, the right combination of factors that make reality vulnerable. Then it begins the slow work of creating a connection, pressing gently against the fabric of reality, finding the weakest threads and carefully, gradually working them loose. What makes a location vulnerable to overlap formation? The most crucial factor appears to be emotional saturation. places where intense emotions have been felt, where suffering has occurred, where trauma has soaked into the very stones and soil. These are the locations that attract the entity's attention. A house where a family was murdered, a hospital where countless people died in pain, a battlefield where thousands fell in terror and rage, a school where tragedy struck and innocence was shattered. These locations carry emotional scars that extend beyond the merely physical. They've been marked by what happened there, changed at some fundamental level, by the intensity of feeling that occurred within their boundaries. This emotional saturation serves multiple purposes for the entity. First, it weakens the barriers between worlds. Intense emotion creates ripples in reality, small distortions in the fabric of space and time. When emotions are powerful enough and sustained enough, these ripples can accumulate, creating lasting weak points that the entity can exploit. Second, locations with strong emotional histories already resonate with the kind of energy the entity feeds upon. They're pre-seasoned, in a culinary sense, already flavored with the suffering that the entity finds most palatable. Third, these locations tend to attract more trauma, more suffering, more intense emotion over time. Dark places become darker. The house where murder occurred becomes the house people whisper about, fear, attribute with malign influence. This fear feeds the location's dark reputation, which feeds more fear, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that makes the location increasingly vulnerable to the entity's attention. The entity's patience in creating overlaps cannot be overstated. It might spend years or even decades working on a single location, gradually increasing its influence, slowly thinning the barriers, waiting for exactly the right moment to establish a full connection. During this preparatory phase, the entity's influence manifests in subtle ways. People in and around the location begin to feel watched, to sense a malevolent presence they cannot quite identify. Dreams become darker, more troubled. Coincidences pile up. Small tragedies, unexplained phenomena, a general sense that something is wrong with the place. These manifestations are the entity testing the connection, probing the weak points, learning about the specific characteristics of this particular slice of reality. As the overlap develops, the entity's influence grows stronger and more direct. The fog begins to appear. Not yet the thick, oppressive presence it manifests as in the realm proper, but in wisps and patches, morning mists that linger too long, or evening fogs that roll in unnaturally fast. People begin to disappear, not in the dramatic fashion of being pulled into the realm during trials, but gradually, mysteriously. Someone goes for a walk and never returns. A child wanders into a patch of fog and is never seen again. These early disappearances might be attributed to normal misfortune, getting lost, meeting with an accident, running away. But they serve the entity's purpose, adding to the location's dark history, deepening the emotional saturation that makes the overlap possible. The prerequisites for forming a stable overlap go beyond simple emotional resonance. The entity seems to prefer locations that are isolated, either physically or psychologically. A farmhouse far from civilization where help cannot easily arrive. An asylum on the outskirts of town that people naturally avoid. A forest that locals know to stay away from. This isolation serves practical purposes. It's harder for authorities to investigate strange occurrences when they happen in places people rarely go. But it also serves emotional purposes. Isolation breeds fear in ways that populated areas cannot. The knowledge that you're alone, that no one will hear you scream, that help is impossibly far away. These realizations intensify emotional responses, making victims more valuable to the entity when it finally claims them. Timing also matters in overlap formation. The entity seems to strike when catastrophe is already unfolding, when emotions are already running high, when reality is already stressed by the weight of human suffering. A family falling apart, parents arguing, violence brewing, a community in crisis, economy collapsing, desperation mounting, a world at war, civilization teetering on the edge of chaos. These are the moments when the entity's influence can most easily take root, when its presence might be mistaken for natural consequence of human darkness rather than external corruption. The entity doesn't need to create suffering from nothing. It simply finds suffering that already exists and amplifies it, guides it, shapes it toward outcomes that serve its purposes. Once an overlap is fully established, it becomes a permanent weak point in reality, a place where the entity can exert influence whenever it chooses. The overlap doesn't constantly bleed entity influence into the world. Instead, it exists in a dormant state most of the time, a potential connection that can be activated when needed. This allows the entity to maintain numerous overlaps across countless realities without overtaxing its attention or resources. Each overlap is like a fishing line cast into a different pond, requiring minimal maintenance until something worth catching takes the bait. The entity's ability to manipulate events within established overlaps demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of causality and human psychology. It doesn't simply make things happen through cosmic power. Instead, it nudges, suggests, influences. A person who might have turned left turns right instead, walking into danger. A decision that seemed reasonable in the moment leads to disaster in retrospect. Coincidences pile up in ways that seem almost purposeful because they are purposeful, guided by an intelligence that understands exactly how to push events toward maximum emotional payoff. The entity is playing chess with reality, thinking dozens of moves ahead, setting up scenarios that will generate intense emotions when they finally reach their conclusion. Hattie Kaur's experiences across multiple dimensions provide some of our most detailed documentation of how overlaps function from the perspective of someone who has encountered them repeatedly. As a psychic investigator drawn to supernatural phenomena, Hattie found herself visiting overlaps without fully understanding what they were. Each overlap she encountered was different, tailored to its specific reality and the entity's particular goals for that world. She witnessed realities where the entity's influence had spread like disease, where vampires or other creatures served as vectors for corruption. She saw worlds where the fog had claimed entire cities, where survivors huddled in shrinking safe zones while darkness closed in around them. Each world was its own experiment, the entity testing different approaches to harvest emotions from that reality's population. What Hattie eventually came to understand was that overlaps weren't random. They were strategically placed, carefully cultivated, designed to maximize the entity's harvest from each reality. An overlap in one location might be used to create a vampire plague that spread fear across a continent. An overlap in another might simply serve as a collection point, a place where individuals with strong emotional potential were drawn and eventually taken into the realm. The entity adapted its methods to each reality's particular characteristics, showing a flexibility that made it incredibly dangerous. There was no single approach to defending against the entity, because it never used the same approach twice. The catastrophes that the entity orchestrates within overlaps are particularly chilling in their variety and specificity. In some realities, the entity has created scenarios involving vampires, not the romantic, brooding creatures of popular fiction, but monsters driven by insatiable hunger, spreading through populations and creating cascading waves of fear as people realize the threat is real and unstoppable. These vampire outbreaks serve the entity's purposes perfectly. They generate intense fear in victims who realize they're being hunted. They create despair in survivors who watch loved ones transform into monsters. They produce rage and determination in those who fight back. Every emotion in the spectrum is represented, all of it feeding the entity's endless hunger. In other realities, the entity's apocalypses take different forms. There are accounts of a fog that transforms people into spiders, not metaphorically, but literally, their bodies breaking apart and reconfiguring into arachnid forms that then attack others, spreading the transformation in an exponential chain reaction. This particular apocalypse scenario is brilliant in its horror. Arachnophobia is one of humanity's most common fears, hardwired into our evolutionary psychology. The idea of becoming what you fear, of your own body betraying you and transforming into something that horrifies you, adds an extra layer of terror to an already nightmarish situation. The entity understands human psychology at the deepest level and crafts its catastrophes to exploit specific fears. The tailoring of apocalypses to specific realities reveals something crucial about the entity's intelligence and methodology. It doesn't simply export the same disaster to every world it touches. Instead, it studies each reality, learning about its particular vulnerabilities, its dominant fears, its cultural anxieties. Then it crafts a catastrophe that resonates specifically with that world's population, that exploits their particular psychological weak points. A world with strong vampire mythology gets vampires. A world with different fears gets different monsters. The entity is like a composer creating a unique symphony for each audience, ensuring maximum emotional impact by playing notes that particular audience is most sensitive to hearing. This customization requires significant intelligence and understanding. The entity must observe each reality it targets, must learn about its history and culture and collective psychology. This observation period might last years or decades or even centuries, with the entity patiently gathering information before making its move. When it finally acts, when it unleashes its carefully crafted apocalypse, the results are devastating precisely because they're so well targeted, so perfectly designed to generate maximum fear and despair in that particular population. But apocalypses serve another purpose beyond simple emotional harvest. They're also recruitment tools. When the entity creates a vampire plague or spider fog transformation or any of its other catastrophes, it's not just feeding on the emotions of victims. It's also identifying potential subjects for its realm. Those who survive such ordeals, who fight through impossible odds, who maintain hope in the face of overwhelming horror. These are exactly the kind of people the entity wants as survivors in its trials. They've already proven their emotional resilience, their capacity to feel intensely while still functioning. They're premium crops, worth the effort of pulling them permanently into the realm. The same is true for those who become monsters during these apocalypses. Someone who transforms into a vampire and embraces their new nature, who hunts former friends and family with enthusiasm rather than reluctance, who finds power in darkness. This person has potential as a killer. The entity watches these transformations carefully, identifying individuals whose psychology makes them suitable for service. Not everyone who becomes a monster during an apocalypse ends up in the realm, but the best ones, those who show true talent for cruelty or true capacity for rage, they get marked for later collection. Surviving an overlap is possible, but exceedingly difficult. The key seems to be recognition, understanding what you're facing and taking action before the entity's influence becomes overwhelming. Hattie survived her encounters with overlaps precisely because she understood, at least partially, what they were. She recognized the signs of entity influence, knew to avoid certain areas, understood that disappearances and strange phenomena weren't random, but evidence of something larger and more terrible. This knowledge allowed her to navigate overlaps more safely than those who stumbled into them ignorantly. But knowledge alone isn't sufficient. Overlaps are inherently dangerous because they're places where the entity's power can manifest directly. The normal rules of reality are suspended or bent within an overlap, making them unpredictable and lethal. Someone in an overlap might find themselves experiencing temporal distortions, where minutes feel like hours or hours pass in what seems like seconds. They might encounter manifestations of the entity's influence, shadow figures, impossible geometry, locations that shouldn't exist. They might feel their emotions being manipulated, fear amplifying beyond what circumstances warrant, hope draining away for no apparent reason. These effects make rational response difficult, even for those who understand what's happening. The geographical extent of an overlap can vary dramatically. Some are confined to a single building or small area, a particular house, a specific grove of trees, a section of street. Others spread to encompass entire towns or regions. The larger the overlap, the more influence the entity can exert, but also the more energy it must expend to maintain the connection. There seems to be a trade-off between scope and intensity. A small, concentrated overlap might allow the entity to exert nearly absolute control within a confined space. A large, diffuse overlap provides broader reach but weaker control over any specific point within its boundaries. The duration of overlaps is similarly variable. Some are temporary, lasting only hours or days before the connection weakens and normal reality reasserts itself. These brief overlaps might serve as reconnaissance missions for the entity, quick forays into a reality to test its characteristics and identify potential targets. Other overlaps are permanent or semi-permanent, becoming established features of a reality that persist for years or decades. These long-term overlaps often become known locations, places with reputations for being haunted or cursed or simply wrong. People learn to avoid them, which ironically makes them more useful to the entity by ensuring that those who do enter are isolated and vulnerable. The Black Veil Cult represents another dimension of overlap phenomenon, though one that works from the opposite direction. Rather than the entity creating overlaps to reach into realities, the Black Veil seeks to create overlaps from within realities, pulling the entity's attention and influence toward them through ritual and sacrifice. These cultists appear across multiple realities, always recognizable by certain common traits, despite the vast differences in the worlds they inhabit. They wear dark clothing that obscures their features. They perform rituals involving pain and blood. They seek out individuals with strong emotional potential and subject them to experiences designed to attract the entity's notice. The cult's existence across the multiverse raises fascinating questions about how information and belief propagate between realities. How does the same basic cult structure appear in worlds that have no apparent connection to each other? The most likely explanation is that the entity itself serves as the connection point, the common thread that links these disparate groups. When the entity takes someone from a reality where the Black Veil exists, that person carries knowledge of the cult with them. If they ever communicate that knowledge to someone who escapes back to a different reality, the seed is planted for the cult to take root there. Over time, across countless realities and countless iterations, the cult's core beliefs and practices spread like a virus, adapted to each reality's particular circumstances, but maintaining fundamental consistency in their worship of the darkness that feeds on suffering. The Black Veil's activities in any given reality often correlate with the presence or imminent formation of an overlap. The cult seems to understand, at least partially, how overlaps work and what the entity requires to establish them. Their rituals aren't simply religious observances. They're practical efforts to create the emotional conditions that make overlaps possible. By generating intense suffering, by performing acts of cruelty and violence, by saturating locations with trauma and pain, the cult weakens the barriers between their reality and the entity's realm. They're preparing the ground, making it easier for the entity to extend its influence into their world. The cult's treatment of individuals like the Deshays twins and Carmina Mora reveals their methodology in detail. They don't simply kill those they capture. Death would be too simple, too clean, too lacking in the prolonged emotional suffering that the entity prizes. Instead, they subject their victims to extended torture, both physical and psychological, designed to generate maximum emotional intensity over the longest possible period. Charlotte and Victor Deshays were experimented on, their conjoined nature studied and exploited, their suffering measured and documented. Carmina Mora had her hands and tongue removed, silencing the artist who had used her work to speak truth to power. These acts weren't random cruelty. They were calculated offerings, sacrifices designed to please the entity the cult served. What makes the Black Veil particularly dangerous is that its members are true believers. They don't serve the entity out of fear or coercion. They've chosen to worship this cosmic horror, convinced that through service they'll achieve some transcendent purpose or receive some terrible gift. This genuine belief makes them more effective than unwilling servants would be. They work with enthusiasm rather than reluctance, take initiative rather than simply following orders, persist through setbacks because failure only strengthens their faith. The entity has cultivated the perfect servants, humans who willingly do its work without requiring constant oversight or motivation. Yet the cult's ultimate fate remains unclear. Do cult members ever achieve what they seek? Does the entity reward faithful service? Or does it simply consume them like any other victim once they've outlived their usefulness? The evidence suggests the latter. The entity is not a god in any traditional sense, not a being that values worship for its own sake. It values emotion, suffering, the harvest of fear and hope and despair. Cult members generate useful emotions in their victims and perhaps in themselves. The twisted satisfaction of inflicting pain, the zealous fervor of religious devotion. But once a cultist has served their purpose, there's no reason to believe the entity treats them any differently than it treats anyone else. They too would be pulled into the realm, into the trials, ground down until their capacity for generating useful emotions was exhausted, then cast into the void like all the rest. The connection between the Black Veil and the Plague's religion becomes clearer when we consider the cult's methods and beliefs. Adiris served a religion that demanded absolute devotion, that glorified suffering as a path to divine favor, that viewed death not as an ending, but as a transition to something greater. The Black Veil demonstrates these same characteristics, suggesting a direct lineage, or at least a shared spiritual ancestor. If Adiris's religion was indeed the first organized worship of the entity, if the survivors of Babylon's fall carried her teachings to other lands and other times, then the Black Veil might be the ultimate expression of that dark faith. It would have evolved over millennia, adapted to different cultures and different eras, but maintained its core truth: that there exists a power beyond human comprehension that feeds on suffering, and that through service to this power, one might achieve something beyond ordinary mortal existence. The theory that Adiris's religion spawned the Black Veil gains support from the cult's apparent age. References to Black Veil activities appear in historical records, going back centuries or even millennia in some realities. The cult is old, ancient even by human standards, suggesting origins in humanity's distant past. The timeline fits perfectly with Babylon's fall and Adiris's transformation into the Plague. Her elevation into the entity's realm, her ascension from mortal priestess to something beyond death, would have been witnessed by her followers. Some would have been horrified, certainly, but others would have seen it as the ultimate validation of their faith. Those believers would have carried her teachings forward, establishing the foundations of what would eventually become the Black Veil. The overlaps, the apocalypses, the cult, all of these represent different facets of how the entity extends its influence across the multiverse, but they all serve the same ultimate purpose: identifying, cultivating, and harvesting emotional energy from conscious beings. The entity is farming on a cosmic scale, with entire realities as its fields and the suffering of countless souls as its crop. The overlaps are the entity's hands reaching into these fields, selecting which plants to harvest, which to leave growing, which to uproot and bring into the realm for more intensive cultivation. Every decision is made with cold calculation. Every action serves the greater goal of sustainable emotional harvest. The entity is patient because it can afford to be, powerful because it has learned how to leverage its power most effectively, and terrifying because it represents a hunger that will never be satisfied, a darkness that will continue spreading across the multiverse for as long as conscious beings exist to fear it. The killers who hunt through the entity's realm come from countless different realities, different time periods, different circumstances. Yet they all share certain characteristics that made them valuable to the entity, that marked them as suitable for the role they now serve. Understanding how the entity selects its hunters requires understanding what the entity actually needs from them. These are not simply weapons to be pointed at survivors. They are complex emotional generators in their own right, carefully chosen instruments that produce specific frequencies of feeling that the entity can feed upon. The selection process is neither random nor simple. It represents some of the entity's most sophisticated work, the culmination of its understanding of human psychology and the mechanics of emotion. The primary criterion for killer selection appears to be emotional intensity. The entity seeks individuals who feel things deeply, whose emotions burn bright enough to be perceived across dimensional barriers, whose psychological states create the kind of ripples in reality that the entity can detect from its position between worlds. This intensity can manifest in many forms: rage that consumes all rational thought, obsession that overrides every other consideration, trauma so profound it reshapes personality, devotion so absolute it permits any atrocity. The specific emotion matters less than its strength, its purity, its capacity to generate the kind of psychic signature that draws the entity's attention, like blood draws sharks. But emotional intensity alone is insufficient. The entity also requires durability, a capacity to sustain that intensity over time without burning out. Many people experience moments of extreme emotion, blinding rage, overwhelming grief, absolute terror. But these moments pass. The intensity fades as the mind protects itself through adaptation and healing. The entity needs individuals whose intense emotions have become permanent fixtures of their psychology, whose trauma or rage or obsession has carved channels so deep that the emotions flow through them endlessly without diminishing. These are people who cannot or will not heal, who have locked themselves into emotional states that define their entire existence. A third criterion appears to be potential for violence. The entity doesn't merely want emotional intensity. It needs hunters who can credibly threaten survivors, who can generate fear through their actions. This doesn't necessarily mean the individual must already be a murderer, though many of the entity's killers certainly are. What matters is the capacity for violence, the willingness or compulsion to harm others when circumstances permit. Some killers, like the trapper or the huntress, already killed before the entity took them. Others, like Nurse or Plague, might not have killed directly, but possessed the psychological preconditions that made violence possible once the right triggers were introduced. The entity can cultivate violence in those who possess the seeds of it, can provide justifications and motivations that allow latent cruelty to flourish. The entity's ability to sense potential killers across the multiverse represents one of its most impressive capabilities. Imagine the entity's perception as something like a vast sensory organ, stretched across dimensional boundaries, constantly monitoring the emotional emanations of countless realities. Most people register as faint blips, their emotions too weak or too fleeting to warrant attention. But certain individuals shine brighter, their psychological states creating emotional beacons that the entity cannot ignore. A young Zabrak child on Dathomir, whose connection to the dark side marks him as extraordinary. A nurse in Illinois, whose mind begins to fracture under the weight of her duties. A girl in Japan, whose rage at her father's betrayal burns with absolute purity. The entity perceives these individuals across the vast distances between realities and begins the process of evaluation and eventual acquisition. The evaluation period can be brief or extended depending on the individual. For some, the entity needs only to observe for a short time before determining they're suitable. Their emotional signature is clear and strong, their potential obvious, their trajectory toward violence or obsession already well established. For others, the entity might watch for years or even decades, monitoring their development, observing how trauma shapes them, waiting for the moment when they transition from potential to actual. This patience is characteristic of the entity's methodology. It doesn't rush. It doesn't take chances. It waits until it's certain that an individual will serve its purposes effectively before investing the energy required to pull them into the realm. Different types of killers serve different purposes in the entity's grand design. Natural killers, those who murdered or terrorized in their original lives, require less cultivation, but might offer less variety in the emotions they generate. These are the serial killers, the monsters, the individuals who already perfected the art of instilling fear. Michael Myers stalking through Haddonfield, the Ghostface prowling city streets for his next victim, the Legion engaging in brutal violence for the thrill of it. These killers bring their fully developed methodologies into the realm, requiring minimal instruction or motivation from the entity. They hunt because hunting is what they do, what they've always done. The entity simply provides them with an endless supply of prey and an environment where their work can continue forever. Created monsters represent a different category. These are individuals who might not have killed in their original lives, or whose capacity for violence was limited by circumstances or psychology, but whom the entity transforms into effective hunters through manipulation or enhancement. Nurse Sally fell into this category. She wasn't a killer in her normal life. She was a caregiver driven to the breaking point by impossible circumstances and personal trauma. But the entity saw in her the potential for transformation, the rage and pain that could be redirected into violence. Through manipulation of her environment and psychology, through pushing her past every limit and breaking point, the entity cultivated a killer where none existed before. The strangling of those final patients, that snapping moment when Sally's mind fractured completely, was the entity's harvest. The transformation of a caregiver into a murderer, a healer into a source of pain. Reluctant killers present their own unique challenges and opportunities. These are individuals who resist their role, who struggle against what the entity wants them to become. The Wraith embodies this category perfectly. Philip Oyomo was not a violent man by nature. He worked hard, followed orders, tried to live a decent life despite difficult circumstances. His descent into killing came through deception and manipulation by his employer Azaroth, who used him to unknowingly dispose of bodies by crushing cars containing living victims. When Philip discovered the truth, when he understood what he'd been made to do, his response was rage. Rage at Azaroth, rage at himself, rage at a world that could permit such deception. That rage, that trauma of unwitting participation in mass murder, was exactly what the entity needed. The entity's handling of reluctant killers reveals its psychological sophistication. It doesn't simply force them to hunt through threats or punishment. Instead, it provides motivations, creates psychological frameworks that make violence feel necessary or justified. The white eyes that certain killers display, Spirit, Wraith, Deathslinger, Doctor, are believed to indicate active perceptual manipulation by the entity. These killers aren't seeing survivors as they truly are. Their vision is being altered, filtered through the entity's influence to show them something else, something that justifies or even demands violence. Spirit, Rin Yamaoka, provides perhaps the clearest example of this manipulation. In life, she was betrayed and murdered by her father in a moment of brutal violence. Her dying oath, her promise to the entity in exchange for the power to take revenge, bound her to its service. But her father is dead, consumed by the rage spirit that possessed him. He exists somewhere in the realm, perhaps, but Rin's need for vengeance remains unfulfilled because its original target is beyond her reach. The entity's solution is elegant and terrible. It allows Rin to see her father's face on every survivor she encounters. Every person she hunts becomes her father. Every injury she inflicts becomes revenge enacted. Every hook becomes justice served. The emotional output this generates is extraordinary. Rin's rage never diminishes because, from her perspective, she's forever killing her father, forever taking the revenge she was promised, but never quite achieving satisfaction because the target respawns endlessly in different forms. The Deathslinger, Caleb Quinn, receives similar treatment. His life was defined by betrayal, by people who used him and discarded him, who stole his inventions and destroyed his future. The rage he accumulated, the list of people who wronged him, became the driving force of his existence. When the entity took him, when he entered the realm and saw the hooks, he also saw something else. The faces of everyone who had wronged him, all the betrayers and thieves and corrupt officials who had destroyed his life. The entity provides him with endless opportunities to exact revenge on these individuals, to hunt them down and make them pay for their crimes. That the survivors aren't actually these people doesn't matter. To Caleb's manipulated perception they are, and his emotional response to hunting them is genuine and intense. The Doctor presents a more complex case. Herman Carter was already a cruel man before the entity took him, already engaged in unethical experiments, already causing suffering for the supposed greater good of advancing knowledge. His white eyes might indicate perceptual manipulation, but what would the entity need to show him to make him more willing to torture? The answer might be that the entity doesn't need to manipulate what he sees, but rather how he interprets what he sees. Carter might perceive the trials as experiments, the survivors as subjects whose suffering generates valuable data. The entity could be feeding him false information, creating the illusion that his work continues to serve some scientific purpose, that the pain he inflicts advances understanding in some meaningful way. This would allow Carter to maintain his self-image as a researcher rather than a simple torturer, providing psychological comfort while ensuring his enthusiastic participation in the entity's designs. Billy, the hillbilly, represents another variation on manipulation. His life was defined by abuse and isolation, locked away by parents who saw him as a monster, treated as less than human because of his physical deformities. When he finally broke free, when he picked up that chainsaw and carved his way through everyone who had wronged him, he was driven by pure rage and pain. In the realm, the entity might show him not his actual parents, who are dead, killed in his rampage, but representations of them, the faces of his abusers superimposed on survivors. Alternatively, the entity might be amplifying his fundamental rage, keeping him in that state of blind fury that characterized his escape from imprisonment. Either way, the emotional intensity serves the entity's purposes while ensuring Billy remains an effective hunter. The entity's patience in cultivating killers is remarkable. Consider the plague, Adiris, whose entire life was a cultivation process. The entity didn't simply find her and take her. It was present throughout her life, whispering to her through her religion, encouraging her absolute devotion, testing her faith through trials and tribulations. The disease that ravaged Babylon, that killed her followers and destroyed her body, might have been the entity's work, a final test to see if her devotion would survive even complete catastrophe. When she continued to pray, when she continued to worship, even as her body failed and her people died, she proved herself worthy. The whisper she heard before killing her mentor, the communication that convinced her to abandon her plans for escape and instead embrace her dark purpose, was the entity's direct intervention, the moment of claiming after years of preparation. The entity sometimes allows killers to maintain their own motivations and methods, recognizing that authenticity generates stronger emotions than artificial manipulation. The trickster, Ji-Woon Hak, doesn't need his vision manipulated. He kills for art, for the aesthetic pleasure of creating beautiful suffering, for the audience response that validates his twisted creative vision. The entity simply provides him with an endless supply of subjects for his work and an audience, itself, that always appreciates his performances. Ji-Woon's genuine enthusiasm for his role makes him particularly valuable. He's not hunting out of rage or revenge or manipulation. He's hunting because he genuinely enjoys it, because it fulfills some artistic compulsion within him. The emotions he generates are authentic to his character, undiluted by resentment or resistance. The huntress, Anna, represents a fascinating case of redirection. She's not hunting out of malice or cruelty. She's hunting because hunting is what she knows, what she's done since childhood, when she survived in the Red Forest alone after her mother's death. Her taking of children, her attempts to care for them despite their inevitable deaths, reveals a twisted form of love rather than sadism. In the realm, the entity doesn't need to fundamentally change Anna's nature. It simply redirects her hunting instinct toward survivors, perhaps making her perceive them as prey animals or potential children to capture and care for. Her emotional state while hunting, focused, purposeful, almost maternal in a horrifying way, generates a different flavor of emotion than pure sadism would, adding variety to the entity's harvest. The acquisition methods vary as dramatically as the killers themselves. The most common method appears to be direct taking through the fog, the entity reaching through an established overlap, at the moment when a potential killer reaches peak emotional intensity. This was how most killers entered the realm. Spirit in her dying moments, Nurse after strangling her last patient, Wraith after killing Azeroth. The entity waits for the perfect moment, when emotions are at their highest and the individual is most vulnerable to being pulled from their reality into the realm. The transition is usually instantaneous from the killer's perspective. One moment, they're in their home, reality experiencing some crucial emotional climax. The next, they're in the fog, in the realm, beginning their new existence as hunters. Some acquisitions involve bargains or deals, though the terms of these arrangements are rarely clear. Spirit explicitly made a deal, swearing an oath to serve the entity in exchange for the power to take revenge. The entity held up its end of the bargain by granting her continuation after death, by preserving her spirit and giving her the ability to hunt. That it also manipulated the terms to its advantage, ensuring she would hunt forever without ever achieving true satisfaction, is characteristic of how such deals tend to work. The entity doesn't lie exactly, but it interprets agreements in ways that favor its own interests. Those who make deals with it rarely get what they truly wanted, though they get exactly what they technically agreed to. The case of Michael Myers presents one of the more intriguing theories about killer acquisition. There's a compelling argument that Myers wasn't taken by the entity at all, but rather followed Laurie Strode into the realm of his own accord. The entity wanted Laurie, sensing her traumatic experience and emotional intensity. When it created an overlap to claim her, Myers was still stalking her, still fixated on his target with that inhuman obsession that defines his character. When Laurie was pulled into the realm, Myers simply followed, too focused on his prey to notice or care that he was passing between dimensions. The entity found itself with an unexpected guest, a killer it hadn't deliberately chosen, but who was already present and armed. Rather than expend energy trying to remove Myers, the entity simply incorporated him into its plans, making use of this obsessive hunter who had delivered himself into its domain. This theory explains certain anomalies about Myers' presence in the realm. He seems less controlled than other killers, less responsive to the entity's will. His add-ons, like the tombstones, allow him to kill survivors outright rather than hooking them, disrupting the normal trial flow in ways the entity wouldn't typically permit. Myers operates by his own rules more than most killers do, suggesting he might not be as thoroughly under the entity's control as others. If he truly wandered into the realm on his own rather than being deliberately taken and prepared, this independence makes sense. The entity is powerful within its domain, but even it might find Myers difficult to fully control, might have decided that accepting his presence with minimal management is preferable to the effort of trying to eject or dominate him completely. Summoning through objects represents another acquisition method, most clearly demonstrated by Pinhead and the Cenobites. The entity didn't directly take Pinhead from his reality. Instead, it acquired the Lament configuration, that puzzle box which serves as the key to summoning the Cenobites. Whether the entity stole the original box or created its own copy is unclear, but the result was the same. When a survivor, Dwight in the recorded instance, solved the configuration, Pinhead was summoned into the realm. This indirect method of acquisition is elegant because it requires minimal energy expenditure from the entity. The box does the work, creating the connection and pulling the Cenobite through. Once present, Pinhead apparently chose to remain, finding the realm's endless opportunities for exploring pain and pleasure to his liking. The Cenobites' continued presence in the realm raises questions about the entity's control over those it didn't directly choose and cultivate. Pinhead has his own powers, his own methods, his own goals that don't necessarily align with the entities. He can open portals to what appears to be his own dimension, the labyrinth, and send survivors there through his Mori. This suggests he maintains connections to his home reality, could potentially leave whenever he chooses. That he stays implies some form of agreement or mutual benefit. Perhaps the realm provides the Cenobites with more subjects to explore than they could easily access in normal reality. Perhaps the entity and the Cenobites have reached some understanding about sharing resources. Whatever the arrangement, it demonstrates that the entity sometimes accommodates powerful beings rather than trying to dominate them completely. The transformation process that killers undergo upon entering the realm varies in intensity. Some arrive essentially unchanged, their physical forms and abilities the same as they were in their original reality. Others receive significant enhancements or alterations that make them more effective hunters. The trapper's incredible strength, far beyond what a normal human could possess, allows him to carry and set his heavy bear traps with ease. The nurse's ability to blink through space, to teleport across distances in an eye blink, seems to be a gift from the entity, rather than something she possessed in life. The spirit's phase walking, her ability to move invisibly between realms, is clearly supernatural, granted by the entity as part of their bargain. These enhancements serve the entity's practical needs. It requires its killers to be effective, to pose genuine threats that can generate fear, but they also serve psychological purposes. By granting powers, by making killers feel strong and capable, the entity encourages their continued participation. A killer who feels powerful, who experiences the satisfaction of successfully hunting prey, generates more intense emotions than one who feels weak or ineffective. The entity wants its killers to feel like apex predators, to experience the rush of successful hunts, because these emotions feed it just as survivors' fear does. The trials are emotional amplifiers for both sides, carefully balanced to ensure maximum output from everyone involved. The entity's handling of killers who resist their programming reveals both its power and its limitations. The Wraith's bell ringing, believed by some to be his attempt to warn survivors of his approach because he failed to warn his village before their massacre, suggests ongoing resistance to his role. Yet he continues to hunt, continues to hook survivors, continues to serve the entity's purposes despite whatever internal conflict he might experience. The entity doesn't require willing service, only effective service. If a killer continues to hunt effectively while wrestling with guilt or reluctance, that internal conflict simply adds another layer of emotion for the entity to feed upon. Some killers seem to change over time, their psychology shifting through prolonged exposure to the realm and endless cycles of hunting. Whether this represents adaptation, degradation, or evolution is unclear. Do killers eventually wear out like survivors do, losing their emotional intensity and becoming less useful to the entity? If so, what happens to them? Are they cast into the void like depleted survivors? Or does the entity have some other disposal method for hunters who outlive their usefulness? The evidence is incomplete, but the entity's constant acquisition of new killers from across the multiverse suggests that turnover occurs, that the current roster of hunters is not fixed, but rather constantly refreshed with new additions as old ones presumably depart. The relationship between killers and the entity is fundamentally transactional. The entity provides opportunities for violence, for revenge, for the satisfaction of compulsions that might have been restricted or punished in the killer's original realities. In exchange, killers generate emotions through their hunting, serving as the instruments through which the entity terrorizes survivors and harvests their fear. This isn't a relationship of equals. The entity holds all the real power, can manipulate perceptions, can presumably punish killers who truly refuse to serve, but it's also not pure slavery. The entity cultivates killers who want to hunt, who find satisfaction in their role, because willing service is more sustainable than forced labor. The variety of killers, their different methods and motivations and emotional states, serves the entity's need for diversity in emotional harvest. If every trial were the same, if every killer hunted with identical methods and generated identical fear responses, the emotional output would become stale, less nourishing. By maintaining a roster of diverse hunters, some brutish and direct like the trapper, others subtle and terrifying like the spirit, still others strange and incomprehensible like the dredge, the entity ensures that each trial feels different, that survivors never quite know what to expect, that fear stays fresh and intense. The killers are instruments in an orchestra, each one playing different notes, but all contributing to the same terrible symphony of suffering that sustains the entity's eternal hunger.